Hello everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today we're talking about GrayZone Warfare, a game that has been highly anticipated by the gaming community. However, I think that this game is almost certainly extremely overhyped, so let's get to this straight away. I wish Madfinger, the dev studio behind GrayZone, the absolute best, and I sincerely do want this game to come out and be absolutely excellent. But the problem is that the community at large believes that this is going to be the second coming of Tarkov. This is not helped by it being reported this way at various news outlets as well. I fear that because of the overhype, it will leave many people at risk of their expectations not being met for this game. If you didn't know, by the way, the early access testing for Q1, which was Madfinger's original target, is now delayed. I didn't realize this until I was scouring around for some more information recently, despite following the game's updates fairly regularly, so I imagine that many of you didn't realize either. Before we continue, if you've been a regular on my channel, you'll probably know that I've been using the Ridge products for over about a year and a half now, and they're part of my daily life. Today's sponsored video is celebrating Ridge's 11-year anniversary because these guys have been around for quite a while, and ever since getting my very first trial wallet, I've always been impressed with the quality of the Ridge stuff, which is why I'm still proud to represent them today. Before taking them on, I genuinely used to go and buy jeans one size up so that I could fit my old wallet and keyring into my pockets more easily, but obviously with the slimline design, I don't have to do that anymore. 12 cards and 6 keys should be enough for nearly everybody, and it helps you keep minimalist rather than just adding to an endlessly growing set of keys. Today, you can save up to 30% using my link at ridge.com/gigaridge for Ridge's 11-year anniversary sale. So that's ridge.com/gigaridge to join the 100,000 strong 5-star rated proud owners of the Ridge wallet. So yes, the GrayZone early access is being delayed slightly, but I do want to point out very strongly that this is not a criticism. I do commend the devs for trying to put out the best version that they can of this first playtest that will be more public, especially given that they didn't think it was quite ready in its current state. In fairness, Q1 was always just a goal or a target, not some specific guarantee that Madfinger had made to anybody, so let's not worry about it too much. So, as to when this playtest is coming, at the time of the recording of this video, we do not know, but it sounds like sooner rather than later. Ultimately, we're just going to have to wait and see and be patient about it. Back to the hype. I'm obviously going to draw many comparisons from Tarkov, despite these two games being different in a few ways, because it's what I, and probably you being on my channel, are most immediately familiar with, and there are certainly elements that cross over and things that we've learned from playing EFT for such a long time. What we do know from Tarkov is that, despite its flaws, a game that has been in the running for nearly 7 years versus a new game that's coming out pre-alpha and early access within roughly the same genre is going to have a very difficult time matching up straight away. Yes, GrayZone is on the Unreal 5 engine, and the game does look beautiful, giving us lots of vibes from other games such as Far Cry or Metal Gear, but there is so much to a game like this under the surface that I think it requires us to temper our expectations at least a little bit. The first point that I think is probably the most important is the PvE-VP style that they are going for, with an emphasis on the E being fighting against the AI and a de-emphasis on the P, i.e. fighting against real players. In Tarkov, this is more balanced between E and P, as you'll probably run into players most matches if you're not just skirting around the edge of the map, whereas GrayZone Warfare is more a combination of DayZ and Tarkov in terms of the way that it is structured. Tarkov's maps, as you know, are instance-based, one raid at a time, and that's it. You go in, you leave, you never know who you're going to play against. DayZ, on the other hand, has permanent servers where when you log out and log back in, you're where you were before with that character, but if you log into a different server, unless it's one of the special official ones with cross-progression, then you're basically starting again with a brand new character, and each server is very separate. GrayZone is kind of a blend of the two. When you log into a server, you're in that server for the entirety of your play session with 16 people on your faction and 16 on the other 2 PMC factions for a total of up to 48 players on the map at any one time. But if you leave and rejoin the game later on, you'll be in a different server with different people. So with the PvP section being de-emphasized, this means that the E part is even more important, and this brings us squarely onto AI. The AI in GrayZone is going to have to be extremely good to make up for the fact that the game de-emphasizes the PvP aspect that we know and love in other shooters of this variety, and this is very difficult to do, as we know from Tarkov itself. The AI there has improved a lot over the years, to be fair, but sometimes it still acts very strangely, almost on rails. They don't react to gunshots or work together necessarily in the best way all of the time. These elements need to be significantly better implemented in GrayZone if the game is going to be primarily about working together as a team to fight the AI. The computer is going to have to work as a team, they will need to have sophisticated movement patterns and tactics, and push you in unexpected ways, otherwise it's just going to be boring. tuning the AI the other way in that Tarkov does with increased accuracy is also obviously not the way to go. Stupid AI with extremely high accuracy is as much of a problem as boring AI that serves no challenge. This leads to cheesing and other such behavior because there's realistically no other way to actually outshoot the aimbot of the computer. The other part about AI is the fact that GrayZone is set in a jungle setting. While this looks beautiful, this means that we're going to be fighting bots through terrain, bushes, trees, and lots of foliage most of the time. Again, bringing this back to Tarkov, which has improved in leaps and bounds here too, but there is nothing more frustrating than being shot by AI through foliage that you can't see through because sometimes AI just doesn't act like real players, and this can also swing too far the other way as well, so it's very hard to tune such that it always feels good. So basically, GrayZone is going to have extremely good AI to keep players coming back again and again, otherwise it risks lack of challenge or potentially frustrating gameplay. As well as the AI themselves, they've obviously got to be guarding something, which brings us onto quests, which do seem to be one of the other main pillars of GrayZone warfare from how it's been described so far, and how you progress is mostly like EFT from what we can tell. Madfinger have said themselves that they don't want players venturing into the world to find X pieces of Y or bring back tons of nonsensical items without meaning, but also that they don't have set spawns or events that will always happen during specific quests, which could help keep missions fresh and interesting. This sounds really good, but is honestly easier said than done. We have been told to look forward to around 150 quests at the early access launch, which is a lot, but depending on exactly how they're made will change how formulaic these tasks feel, as well as how easy they are to do. Madfinger says that because they strongly believe in players' intelligence and try to stay away from excessive hand-holding, that we shouldn't expect any massive waypoint markers guiding you step by step through the world. And by this, I really do hope that they are trying to steer clear away from the Tarkov style of quests if at all possible. Although not story-driven, I do believe that this game is going to have more of a storyline right from the outset, with the centre of the map being some kind of strange event that we have to figure out, but we don't really know too much about that as of yet, and to be fair, there's only a relatively short amount of time that a mystery can unfold unless it's done in a very clever multiplayer live service kind of way. Again, these things are easier said than done, and as for the individual quests themselves, that will likely make up most of the regular gameplay in GrayZone, unless they are done in a procedural fashion which is also engaging and interesting. You do run the risk of always allowing the quest to be wickified like they are in Tarkov. The more obscure, tricky, and most importantly formulaic that you make them, the greater proportion of players will seek external assistance like we have in Tarkov with the wiki. We've been through full circle in EFT with quest items being dynamic in some way, but because the quest descriptions are simply inadequate most of the time, the community instead documents every possible spawn location for many quests, allowing, and in many cases borderline forcing players to bypass any immersion, and instead seek out the checklist of places to look on the wiki, which doesn't solve the issue at all. Basically, Madfinger needs to really think carefully about how the quest should be designed, and especially the original text and follow-up clues, and how to make these engaging for players. This requires deciding on exactly what you want players to get out of each task, and how you want them to act when they are given the information that enables them to work out what to do. Now, we are watching the recently released 20-minute plus preview of the gameplay that shows generally how the game looks at this current stage of development. Again, it's pre-alpha and very, very early, but this shows us something about the gunplay animations, recoil, and that kind of thing that we might expect when we get into it ourselves. From what I've seen so far, I don't think any of this worries me particularly because of how early it is in the development cycle, but it would be remiss not to point out that some of the animations, third-person walking in particular, is a little bit clunky, and there doesn't seem to be a great deal of recoil either. This is not necessarily bad in and of itself, but more the feel of the recoil and its impact on the character, which doesn't quite seem to be there at this stage. I don't get the sense of immersion from the character firing in first person as if they are actually doing it, which is probably due to things like muzzle flash smoke or gas being missing and that kind of thing, but I'm sure this will come with time. The gunplay so far kind of reminds me of DayZ, really quite long range in a lot of circumstances, and it seems like much of GrayZone will be played using scopes. I don't imagine that many people will be using red dots primarily like they are here in the gameplay preview unless they are extremely rare, and the hardest thing about judging the gunplay is that we don't have the opportunity to play it. The best that we can do is watch the video and try to come to some first conclusions. But even something as straightforward as gunplay can significantly harm a new title and how it is perceived by the community at large because it's really important in a shooter. We also saw some of the medical system being used on our showcase characters. Nothing too crazy compared to what we're used to from other similar games. However, what I would say is that previously we've also seen some ballistic testing as well using gel within the game, and this doesn't necessarily give me cause for concern because I do love a bit of detail. But I personally believe, especially after playing Tarkov for a very long time and seeing the myriad different mechanics in that game come and go in different forms, get changed, nerfed, buffed, etc., that a big emphasis on different types of bullets creating different types of wound impacts, which then in turn creates a different amount of damage with different medical items being needed to be applied to your player character to fix them, as well as the enhanced ballistics that come with this whole system, such as penetration through multiple layers of terrain out in the field, doesn't necessarily enhance the overall gameplay and immersion of the player. The problem with all of this is that at some point the complexity becomes unnecessary, and as we've seen in Tarkov, too much complexity can actually bring practical randomness into the system instead. It's a little bit like rolling a dice. Yes, in theory you can calculate the angle of the dice as it comes out of the cup at a certain speed and the height at which it's thrown and what speed it ends up impacting with the table and calculate the roll to be able to figure out exactly what number is going to be rolled on the dice when it stops moving. This is all technically possible in theory, and the system is very complex, but practically speaking, no human is able to do that in real time, and so the result ends up being a random number out of 6. Adding complexity to a system does not always necessitate complexity in outcome or decision making, and most importantly, it doesn't always necessarily change the behavior of the player in a way that is engaging or interesting if the outcome is practically random anyway. Obviously, this game is going to be online, and of course will be played with other people across the world against the AI, but also against each other. We've seen the many problems that netcoders plagued Tarkov with, and I don't know how much experience Madfinger have with multiplayer networking in general, probably more so than the Tarkov devs when they first started their game, but I've seen examples of the Overwatch devs talking about how they manage this in terms of synchronization and latency between players, prediction of player movements, and clients being readjusted. The list goes on. This whole field is a science of its own and is extremely complicated. When you have lots of players from different countries with latency and desynchronization between them, every single person's instance of the game is different from everyone else's, including from the server itself. As I said, we've seen these issues plague Tarkov for a long time, and I just hope the same doesn't happen to GrayZone. Speaking of being on the internet and playing against other people, it is unfortunately necessary to talk about cheaters. I have seen lots of people talk about GrayZone as going to be this amazing game where they're going to be able to escape from Tarkov's cheaters, but unfortunately the reality is that every single FPS game that is remotely successful suffers from cheaters. Even those that don't have a direct economic link for RMT, like Tarkov does, are affected very badly, and I am certain that GrayZone Warfare will be no exception to this if it becomes popular, as it seems that it will, if there is PvP, which there most certainly is, and if there is loot progression with high and low value items and other equipment that people want, which there also is. I am also absolutely sure that the Madfinger team is taking this extremely seriously, but it is a problem that everybody has in the FPS genre in particular, and it's not one that's really solvable. You just work as hard as you can against it. So don't expect to come to GrayZone Warfare and have no cheaters and it be your great escape out of the Tarkov universe away from Head Eyes every raid, because I am very sure that it cannot be perfect in this regard, given that nobody else has managed it so far. Alright, so moving away from this topic a bit, one element of GrayZone that we've been told about regarding the structure of the game that makes me worry a little bit is the way that PMC Karma exists. As a community, we've worried about this for a very long time in Tarkov, and this is going to be in GrayZone right from the word go. With 3 different factions, if you're playing with, say, a squad of 4 on a 16-player team within your PMC faction, that leaves at most 12 other players on your team that you're not really supposed to shoot, and 16 players on the 2 opposing teams. This does mean that you're more likely to run into opposition PMCs, but given that there is no PvP incentive outside of loot directly, as the devs have said, you won't ever get a quest to kill another PMC, it's difficult to know at this point how players will interact with that system. This mostly depends on how GrayZone sets up the reward incentive. If loot is extremely hard to come by, and especially high-tier military stuff, then you'll be more incentivized to kill players from other teams. If factional penalties are too high for killing your own team, then you'll be less incentivized. But setting these penalties too high, and players may end up in a situation like Scav Karma now, where Scavs basically don't ever want to kill each other if you're somebody that cares about rep, and this leads to annoying situations where someone can be shooting at you, but you simply can't shoot back for risk of losing your reputation unless you're directly hit yourself first. In many cases, this means that you just have to suck it up and let them kill you, which is really not a good way for the game to be. I don't know how much identification there is going to be for figuring out who is on what team from a PMC perspective in GrayZone, but I believe that Madfinger has said so far that the teams won't really be that identifiable between them, and they all have the same equipment, at least in the initial version of the game. If the reputation penalty for killing your own team is too high, this could potentially make PvP completely non-existent for fear of losing it if you do accidentally murder somebody on your own faction. If the penalties for killing your own team isn't high enough though, this means that PvP will likely always happen instead, and the player behavior will revert back to what I think of as the default state of shoot on sight, which is typically what you get when you don't have any rules in place at all. Finding a balance between these two ends of the PMC engagement spectrum that is fun and interesting is extremely hard. My personal opinion is that PMCs on the same team need a way to communicate with each other effectively. For example, if you arrive in a server and the other players on your faction are already out on a mission, you would need a way to figure that out and where they have planned to go. Maybe even a radio channel so that you can speak to the others, or some kind of map that updates every so often, or maybe a notice board with a big map on it and a mission that they're going to do with the LZ that they landed on, something like this, so that you can at least plan to avoid them even if they're not talkative over radio. GrayZone needs to manage this balance extremely carefully because it has huge implications for how players interact with the game, which missions they pick, and whether they shoot at other players or not, because in a similar vein to my AI comments earlier, having no players from different factions ever think it's worth shooting at each other is almost as bad as everybody shooting on sight all the time. The final point that I have for you today is something that I can't really quantify, which is the vibe of the game. Helldivers 2 is an extremely good example of a game that has a very good vibe, and there are other games that I've played recently like Darktide that also has this, but I've also played plenty of games that don't have a very good vibe too. It's very difficult to put your finger on exactly what this means. For example, it's extremely hard to explain Helldivers 2 to somebody else that hasn't ever seen it and have them understand just how cool it is and how immersive it is and how well the world is built, which makes you feel like you're part of the game and maybe even something bigger than just yourself. Tarkov does this in some ways through interesting map design and the constant threat of meeting other players, and otherwise relies on the feelings of progression both in-game and for you yourself and your own skills to keep players committed, but there are other ways that it could be done better for sure. What brings most of us back time and time again is the risk-reward. Without playing GrayZone for at least 10-20 hours, we won't really know what the vibe of the game is, and if the vibe is just kind of meh, then no matter what the systems look like or how beautiful it is or how good the gunplay is or whatever, if it's missing and it feels hollow in some sense, then people simply won't play it. This is ultimately why I do think that GrayZone Warfare is probably overhyped. Yes, I absolutely want them to do the best they can to meet the expectations of the community and that the game comes out wonderfully, which I would love nothing more than to see. But I think that people's expectations have driven way ahead of the reality on what this team can produce, and many are expecting a 7-year-plus development game like Tarkov with a AAA budget and indie ideas all combined into one beautiful package, because we're so desperate for something else in this genre to be good. Even if we're a player that still plays Tarkov and still loves Tarkov, we'd love to have an alternative that has as much depth and intrigue and keeps us playing for 1,000 hours plus, because there just isn't anything else. On this basis, I simply don't see how GrayZone can live up to that expectation in general, at least on the initial early access build. I have thought a lot about games that have gotten popular, and in many cases they aren't really known about beforehand. A large amount of legacy games that are still popular today were mods originally, and I really do think this is because it is extremely difficult to create a game that is super compelling, just in general. StarCraft was a wonderful game that I used to watch a lot of the pro scene esports on back in the day. A game which almost certainly was not designed to be played at that higher level, by the way. It just ended up like that because of many accidental design choices that all compiled together to make one of the best competitive experiences of all time. And then watching the development of StarCraft 2 really showcased the difficulty of brute forcing a good experience, even with a very seasoned development studio. Many others have tried to force a good player experience, but time and time again, we see that some of the biggest games are often birthed out of mods, which is very Darwinian in its mechanism. 1,000 mods are created, 999 of them suck, and one of them is brilliant and ends up becoming a genre-defining title. Obviously, this isn't exactly the case for Tarkov, but in some ways I would still put Tarkov in this category. The devs never expected it to become this popular, and yet here it is still, flaws and all, leading the extraction shooter genre with basically no real competitor. Is it kind of by accident that Tarkov ended up here? Well, pretty much, yeah. On this basis, it's almost unreasonable for us to pick any game before release and expect it to be as good as these other ones that we're playing, simply due to the various unquantifiable reasons that these other games are so good in the first place. So, I really do hope GrayZone Warfare is a fantastic game. I want the devs to keep working on it, and I'm very much looking forward to playing it myself too, to see what it is like. But I worry that the community's expectation of what this game is going to be like is going to be a large disappointment, simply because the hype is so high at the moment. It would be extremely unfortunate if the game was taken down by its own hype getting ahead of itself before it really is ready for us to play properly. But I will be ecstatic if I'm proven wrong. As usual, a big shout out to all my patrons, and as always, have fun in your raids.